يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي، لأجلك يا بهية المساكن، يا زهرة المدائن، يا قدس يا قدس يا قدس يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي. عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، ترحل كل يوم، تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة، وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد.
عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم،
ترحل كل يوم،
تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة، وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد.
يا ليلة الإسراء، يا درب من مروا إلى السماء، عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، وإن
conference on Palestine. Today we have two sessions. We had two sessions, and we will have our third one, which is session number 6. Today we will have kind of conversation. This is different than the previous two sessions. This is a kind of conversation between Professor Finkelstein and Professor Hashemi, which is a conversation on Palestine after the recent war on Gaza. Professor Nader Hashemi is the director of Center for Middle East Studies and an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic Studies at University of Edinburgh. Professor Hashemi, it's good to see you again, and thank you for moderating this session. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's great to be in conversation with Norman Finkelstein, who is, not only a leading scholar on the topic, but an old friend of mine. So Norman, we only have 45 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to keep your answers as short as possible. But for this first question, it's a big question, so take a little bit more time. And it's the question that's on the mind of, I think, many people who've been involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict, particularly on Israel-Palestine solidarity work in terms of advancing a just solution. And the question is, the big question, is how do we seize this unique moment to advance a just resolution of the conflict, given that roughly 40 days ago, everyone thought it was over, but the recent Israel-Gaza war has drawn global attention to this conflict. It has led to a shift in American public opinion. It has united sort of Palestinians in ways that they haven't known before. And I'd like you to answer the question against the backdrop of something that you wrote a while ago that deeply resonated with me, and that is, lessons for political struggle that we can and should learn from Mahatma Gandhi, where you noted that one of the lessons for politics that Gandhi taught us is that the object of political struggle is not to ideologically convert people to a new cause, but get them to act on issues that they already deeply feel is wrong. So given that backdrop, given that insight from Gandhi, and given where we are today, at this moment where there is renewed energy and enthusiasm to advance a just resolution of this conflict, what are the priorities? What do you think should what are the next steps for those of us who've been involved in Israel-Palestine solidarity work for a very long time and want to sort of take full advantage of this unique moment?
Well, obviously, there were significant shifts that were registered during the Israeli attack on Gaza, as well as shifts which became clear after Israel suffered a significant, I would say, military defeat during what it called Operation Guardian of the Walls. The nature of that military defeat, I'm not going to go into now. I'll look at more specifically what you asked me to address, which is the politics. I would say that politically, not just the Israeli assault itself, those 10 days, but what preceded it, namely the Human Rights Watch report, A Threshold Crossed, the B'Tselem report, its position paper, which declared, in its opinion, that Israel had become an apartheid state, inclusive of the state of Israel, not just in the occupied Palestinian territories. That registered at what you might call the level of progressive public opinion. That represented, or that marked, a significant shift, with both Human Rights Watch saying that Israel was a state based on Jewish domination, B'Tselem saying Israel was a state based on Jewish supremacy, B'Tselem saying Israel was, from the river to the sea, so to speak, an apartheid state. Human Rights Watch saying Israel was practicing apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories. There was, in addition, the new factor of the civil revolt by Israeli Palestinians, which registered their deep discontent, not just with Israel's assault on Gaza, but also with its second-class status, and probably less than second-class status, in a self-declared Jewish state, which is designed and intended to serve the interests not of its citizens, but of the Jewish people. In light of all those factors, I left out another factor which ought to be registered, namely the unprecedented, at least in recent times, the unprecedented unity demonstrated by the Palestinian people across its many fragmentations and fracturings. The people in Gaza, the people in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the Palestinians in Israel. I can't speak for, but there seems to have also been support among Palestinians in the refugee camps scattered around the Arab world. So there's that factor, that it seemed as if Israel had succeeded in fragmenting and fracturing the Palestinian people, but this last Israeli assault put that to a lie. So I would say politically, things are right now in flux. It's hard to say what a new Palestinian agenda will look like. And until a representative meeting of the various elements or components of the Palestinian people convenes and a document crystallizes in which their political agenda is laid out, I would say at this point it's premature to predict where things are going in terms of, to use your word, a resolution of the conflict. But you also said, how do we take advantage of, how do we exploit the current political moment? And it seems to me the right strategy was actually the one, surprisingly, the one that was laid out in the Human Rights Watch report recommendations. In its list of recommendations, it recommended to the Palestine Liberation Organization that for the moment it focus on realizing the human rights of the Palestinian people and not to focus on political solutions. I think that's correct because there is no consensus, as far as anybody knows. There is no consensus on the political solution. One state, two state, binational state, democratic secular state, Muslim state, Islamic state. We don't know. So my view is right now, we should focus exactly as you pointed to Gandhi's strategy. We should focus on those aspects of Israeli supremacy or Israeli domination, which it wouldn't take much energy to persuade the public of its wrongness. And I would say the two issues on which there is a broad consensus are one, lifting the blockade of Gaza, a long-standing issue about which there are some areas where it might be difficulties might set in. For example, the issue of, in exchange for lifting the blockade, Hamas disarming itself. That will be a contentious area, but lifting the blockade in Gaza and ending the land theft, the land confiscations, the land robbery in the West Bank, I think that's a very realizable objective now in light of the publicity that was given, the light that was shined on the illegal land confiscations in East Jerusalem, the whole issue of the settlements. I think there's a reasonable prospect that those two items, namely lifting the blockade and ending the illegal land theft in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, I think those should be the first items on any political agenda right now. And I, at any rate, believe that we should leave to the side for the moment until a Palestinian consensus crystallizes the question of solutions.
You mentioned Palestinian leadership or lack thereof. It's one of the issues that I've been quite interested in the context of this particular struggle. And one of the tragedies, as most people know, one of the tragedies of the Palestinian people is that they've suffered from, very incompetent and corrupt leadership. So as a student of history, as a student of politics, the big question that I'd like you to reflect on is the following. Is Palestinian national liberation or a Palestinian state possible without competent, effective, and representative leadership? If you look at all of the major successful cases in the 20th century, Gandhi in India, Ben Bella in Algeria, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, East Timor, you go through the list. Competent leadership, effective leadership, incorruptible leadership was an essential ingredient to national independence and victory. In the case of the Palestinians, it's the exact opposite. It's let's just say the Palestine Authority, to put it charitably, leaves a lot to be desired. So how do you factor the question of leadership or the absence of effective leadership into the struggle for Palestinian human rights and national rights? I tend to put a lot of value on it. I wanted to draw you out on this topic.
Well, I very rarely comment on those issues. First of all, because I'm not particularly knowledgeable on them. I don't follow internal Palestinian politics with any degree of conscientiousness. And second of all, simply not a concern of the solidarity movement. The solidarity movement would, of course, prefer to have a competent leadership, but we don't have any real say over the matter. And rationally speaking, we should focus on those aspects of the struggle where we can have a say and where our input would be significant. And frankly, if you believe in the basic principle of self-determination, we shouldn't have a say. The issue of self-determination is a complex one in international law. The Palestinians have been recognized under international law as a people. And that is a significant threshold because under international law, you can't claim a right to self-determination unless you constitute a people. Now, the United Nations has at a certain point crossed that threshold and recognized the Palestinians as a people. And then once having recognized them, then the question is, what form of being a people, they're therefore entitled to self-determination. And then the question becomes, what form will this self-determination take? And under international law, there are basically three different forms of national self-determination. One is you simply elect to become citizens of the state in which you are, under which you are currently existing. So that would be a kind of, you might call it a kind of political assimilation. Second possibility is you acquire certain special rights under a unified state. So you could say the people of Quebec exercise a kind of self-determination within the framework of the Canadian state. The same is true of the Basques, the same is true of the Catalans, that you have a self-determination within the framework of a larger state, and you get to exercise certain rights beyond those of citizenship, say language rights or cultural rights generally. That's a kind of a vague version of federalism, though it can take other forms except federalism. And the third form, obviously, of self-determination is to form an independent state of your own. So the Palestinians have to, first of all, choose among those options. And then once you choose among the options, there are the subsidiary questions. Namely, if you ever read a book by James Crawford called The Creation of States Under International Law, Crawford just passed away a couple of weeks ago. He was the leading authority in the world on the creation of states, how states are formed. And you discover in reading the book that states can take 10,000 different forms. Well, not 10,000, but quite a significant variety. There are many permutations and combinations of a state, of what rights the state exercises under international law. What is the range and the limits of sovereignty exercised by this or that state? The point is, these are quite complex questions, but they're not questions that either you or myself will or should have any say over. So I think that it would be presumptuous as well as arrogant to decide from afar what choices the Palestinians elect in those regards. However, I have to also make a second point. The second point is it doesn't end, the political issue does not end with the choices the Palestinians make, because there's also the rights as well as responsibilities, but the rights of other states. In this case, the rights of the state of Israel. And it may, for example, let's say hypothetically, the Palestinians convene a representative movement. Hamas is the dominant element in that representative Congress, and it's able to muster enough support for a Muslim or Islamic state in all of historic Palestine based on Sharia law. It's possible. I can't say it's an impossibility. It's certainly a possibility that that could happen. But then there's the question of what rights the Israelis have in this adjudication of the national rights of the Palestinians versus the state of Israel. And then my point being, once the Palestinians have put together a program, an agenda, a point to a political resolution, we then have to wait and see how does the international community react to the Palestinian agenda, because that also is a critical factor. You named a lot of struggles. It's kind of unthinkable that even the struggle in apartheid would have succeeded had it not had the support of all of Africa. What were called back then, and my memory is pretty clear on these things, what were called the 5 frontline states during the struggle of South Africa. And then there was the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, and then that branched out into support all around the world. I won't say those were the decisive factors, but I would say those were critical factors in enabling the end of apartheid. So there are many steps. There's first what the Palestinians themselves decide, then there is the reaction of the international community to the resolution that the Palestinians reach consensus on. I think that we are very early in those stages, but that doesn't mean there's nothing to do. We may not achieve a political resolution in the short term. I consider it highly unlikely, but certainly you can improve significantly the lives of Palestinians if we focus on, as Human Rights Watch suggested, the realization of the full human rights of the Palestinians. That has to mean in Gaza ending the blockade, and it has to mean the West Bank ending the settlement activity, which is effectively settlement activity should be, I think, more properly described as the land theft in the West Bank.
One of the issues that you were strongly criticized for by Palestine activists, mostly from the BDS, was your steadfast support for international law and a two-state settlement based on international law. Now there's the Human Rights Watch apartheid report. There's the B'Tselem apartheid, position paper. There is a new paradigm shift, as you've sort of indicated, in terms of how at least human rights organizations are looking at the Israel-Palestine conflict. But at the same time, if you listened to the UN Secretary General's comments during the recent Israel-Gaza war, he was still articulating the international consensus of two states based on 67 and based on, Palestinian self-determination in the Israeli occupied territories of 1967. So given that that backdrop still exists, that at least the UN Secretary General is still upholding what many states in the world believe is a just resolution of this conflict based on two states, and given this new changing paradigm that the human rights organizations are articulating, how do you see these two sort of competing interpretations of a just resolution of the conflict playing themselves out? They seem to be in competition. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think there's 2 issues there. First of all, my own position, and second of all, a proper representation of what the current international consensus is. I should say, our images have disappeared from the screen. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. So let me start with the first point. I am not a supporter of international law. I've never been a particularly strong supporter of international law. It's not a question of, this is, I think, a confusion peculiar to the Palestine struggle, where people have this idea, or those involved in the struggle have the idea that you decide on your own the terms of a debate. The terms of the debate, in large part, not entirely, but in large part, the terms of the debate are determined for you, not by you. In the 1970s and the 1980s, when I was active in politics, international law was a totally marginal issue. Nobody really discussed it. There was a long case going on regarding South Africa, the Namibia case, which lasted from 1950 to 1971. It kept going back and back and back and back and back to the ICJ. But aside from those who are specialists in international law, it simply didn't figure, international law didn't figure as a major element in politics. You have to remember, and you're too young to remember, that there really weren't human rights organizations in the world until the 1980s. Amnesty International was around in the 1970s, but it was a very marginal organization until it was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. That's when it became front and center. I wouldn't say front and center, but that's when it was catapulted to public attention. Human Rights Watch doesn't begin to make a mark until the 1980s. B'Tselem doesn't emerge, the Israeli Human Rights Organization doesn't emerge until 1990. If I began to study international law, it was only because I realized it was the current political climate, the current political context. It had become, in significant part because of the Human Rights Organization's intervention, it became a significant element in trying to persuade public opinion. And that, in my opinion, is supposed to be the objective of political activists in the West. So you could cite human rights reports in order to document Israel war crimes and crimes against humanity under international law by referring to mainstream credible organizations. And that became a quite powerful, quite potent weapon. Eventually, you could cite not only UN General Assembly resolutions, but you can cite, even by 2004, you can cite an International Court of Justice advisory opinion on Israel's construction of the wall. So there was now this quite elaborate political legal infrastructure that one, it seemed to me, had to lean on in order to make a persuasive case in the court of public opinion. But I've studied enough international law and also domestic law, Supreme Court law, to know that law is just politics by other means. It's, if you take any of the, for example, domestic Supreme Court decisions of the last few decades, everything from Brown versus Board of Ed on desegregation to gay rights, gay marriage, abortion, all of those are purely political decisions, masked in the language of law, but the decisions actually are totally unpersuasive, totally unconvincing, completely poorly argued. They are the result of politics, the shifts in public opinion in the United States. So I have no illusions about international law, but there are elements of it which, in my opinion, do correspond to a reasonable interpretation of justice and therefore can be supported, embraced, and used as a weapon in the battle for public opinion. As to the paradigm shift, I think there's been a certain exaggeration due to the fact that most people, that's the culture we live in, they don't read, they just tweet. If you read the B'Tselem report, it's explicit that it, quote, takes no position on the political resolution of the conflict. Human Rights Watch, in its report, is explicit in maintaining the nomenclature of two states because it refers to the state of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. If you use that kind of nomenclature, you're in effect saying that the essential paradigm for resolving the conflict has not changed. I think there is a kind of hastiness to prove that now the one state, so to speak, one democratic state, one secular democratic state, that solution has been vindicated. But frankly, that's not what the Human Rights Watch report said. That's not what the B'Tselem report said. And I don't think it's the job of people to decide for Palestinians what should be their fate. Things are in flux now, and it should be them who decides. If you look at the opinion polls, for example, right now, at this moment, it's clear that Hamas got a big boost to its popular support after the last Israeli assault in Gaza. I think one would be very hard-pressed to say that Hamas supports a single democratic secular state in Palestine. That's not really a credible interpretation of its political program. So when you impose that paradigm, you're in effect negating the stated and tacit aspirations of what, as far as one can tell from opinion polls, is the overwhelmingly, at this point, overwhelmingly popular leadership among the Palestinians, namely the Islamic movement.
Yeah. Now, I would just add to that, if you take the other side of the Palestinian national movement, the secular side, the official position of Fatah is not for, a binational state or a secular state. It's for, two states based on the 1988 PLO meeting in Algiers. And then if you go to the other side of the equation, within Israel, the vast majority of Israeli Jews are not in favor of a binational state or a secular democratic state. So that raises, serious questions about the practicality of pushing that paradigm. But on a related point, when this, one state, two state debate emerged, I remember Professor Chomsky offering an interesting intervention in this debate where he effectively said that if you're serious about a binational state or some sort of secular democratic state down the road, a preliminary prerequisite to get from where we are today to that ideal state would be to support a two-state settlement based on international law and the 67 borders. Because, where we are in terms of public opinion, not just among Palestinians, as you pointed out, but among Israelis, and the international consensus of most states is not ready to accept that that type of paradigm shift, which is radical and which is in many ways utopian. Do you have any thoughts on that particular?
I tend to defer on these matters to my old friend and extremely competent scholar, Maureen Rabbani, and we've had a substantial exchange of opinions both over Zoom and also in private correspondence. And he's very strongly of the opinion that short of an overwhelming, devastating Israeli defeat at the hands of its adversaries, there is no way that the Israeli Jews are going to let go of the Jewish majority in any resolution of the conflict. Now, I think after I heard him out, I found it a persuasive point, except I would add the caveat that we're talking about the short term. If we look at the United States, look, when I was growing up, the United States was a white country, or a white majority country. And nobody could conceive, literally, it couldn't be conceived that the US would be anything but a white majority country. It took a long period, a long evolution in the United States. It began with something very bloody called the Civil War, by far the most costly war in American history. 500,000 Americans died in the Civil War or were killed in the Civil War. Then it took the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Then it took, after Jim Crow, it took the Brown decision, the Supreme Court. Then it took the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965. It took a lot of legislation, a lot of politics, a lot of struggle, brutal struggle, violent struggle. And now, the most census predictions are that within my lifetime, maybe within my lifetime, the United States will become a white minority country. And my impression is most Americans are prepared to let go of the white majority if a demagogue doesn't come along and there's an economic breakdown. But just as the US was ready for a black president after a very long, as I say, long evolution that required a lot of struggle, a lot of sacrifice. Just as the U.S. is ready to have a black president, the U.S. is now poised for the prospect of the U.S. becoming a white minority country. So with that in mind, I've said to Maureen, I could see the possibility that over the long term, that Jews in the state of Israel, as they feel a certain amount of confidence and confidence that it will work, will let go of that Jewish majority. But that's a ways off. Judging by the United States, it's a ways off before that happens. Now, what will be the intermediate steps? I don't want to predict. Because, first of all, politics is very hard to predict. And second of all, because I think the first step has to be, we have to see what the Palestinians themselves resolve on. I don't even know what the Palestinians in Israel want. Mm-hmm. Do they want one state? I don't know. We have to wait and see with these things.
I'm of the view that if there's a significant and principled shift in U.S. policy toward the Israel-Palestine conflict, along the lines of, of what we've seen from Bernie Sanders and others in the Democratic Party, the progressive elements, if there's a significant shift in U.S. policy toward Israel-Palestine, that could unlock the sort of the bottleneck or the problem here in terms of advancing a resolution of the conflict. It would shake things up, particularly within Israel. Do you have the same opinion?
Of course, the U.S. is the critical factor, and the U.S. is the critical impediment to finding a resolution. The problem with formulations like that, in my opinion, is that there seems to be a confusion between saying that the U.S. is the principal obstacle to resolving the conflict on the one hand, but then making the leap that if the U.S. did revise its policy, it's going to revise its policy in the direction of one democratic secular state. There's not a scratch of evidence to support that. There's, Bernie Sanders was a powerful critic of the state of Israel. He was also an unshakable, and is still an unshakable supporter of the two-state settlement. So when you talk about breaking through the bottleneck, it's breaking through the bottleneck, which is very significant, obviously, but it's breaking through the bottleneck to what? What is the resolution? And there's still, a lot of room for disagreement, though as of now, the two-state settlement is pretty stable, though I would say that one component of the two-state settlement has now been thrown into significant question, and that's the component of Israel, the state of Israel, its discriminatory policies towards the Palestinians. That has now, as a quote-unquote theoretical matter, been thrown into question by the position paper of B'Tselem and the report of Human Rights Watch, and as a practical matter, it's been thrown into question by the upheavals in the state of Israel during Israel's last assault on Gaza. And even people like Bernie Sanders will be hard-pressed henceforth to defend a state of Israel which is discriminatory or practices discrimination against its non-Jewish citizens. So the original two-state settlement was typically construed as Israel as is over here and a Palestinian state beside it. I put the emphasis on Israel as is. Now, the question of, yes, Israel, but not Israel as is anymore. Namely, this notion of a Jewish nation state, the notion of Jewish domination of a state, of Jewish supremacy, that's been called into question. And so I do think that at least one aspect of the two-state settlement is no longer stable.
Mm-hmm. Norman, we've been given 10 more minutes. Can you stick around?
Sure.
So let's return to sort of the broad theme of this conference, which is the question of apartheid. And of course, we're having this discussion against the backdrop of those landmark human rights interventions in the debate by Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem. I think I recall reading something by you in the 1990s where you drew a comparison between Israel and South Africa on the question of apartheid. And I wanted to use this moment to get you to comment on the limits of the comparison. I mean, the comparison is obviously there in terms of, the domination of one ethnic group over the other, and the international, dimensions of this conflict. But what would you say some of the key differences are that limit us using the paradigm of South Africa and apartheid to understand and advance a just resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict? Could you reflect on that?
Well, I remain a voracious reader, and I love to read both history, but also theory. Some, I wouldn't call it theory, but more abstract issues being raised. On the other hand, we have to keep in mind that our goal is a political one. Our goal is to try to achieve a just resolution of the conflict, or at the minimum, to try to mitigate the crimes that are being committed in the here and now. And I always like to keep that in mind, the old African American spiritual, to keep your eyes on the prize, to remember what it's all about. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I don't believe, and I'm sure Professor Al-Arian will disagree with me, and he's free to intervene if he likes. I do not believe it is a prudent thing to focus on the term apartheid. Apartheid became extinct in 1990 as a political institution. It did continue as a legal denotation because the international community, or its legal component, adopted this notion of the crime of apartheid under international law. The problem with this crime of apartheid under international law is that you get bogged down in all of these terminological debates and discussions, which lawyers thrive on, but which the public grows quickly bored of. Mm-hmm. So if you read the Human Rights Watch report, a threshold crossed, it focused on apartheid. It then proceeded to define apartheid. And it said apartheid has three components: domination, oppression, and inhumane acts. Now you have to have those three elements in play to constitute the crime of apartheid. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that trying to define domination, oppression, and inhumane acts is not an easy undertaking, especially because no country on earth has yet been charged by an international body with the crime of apartheid. So there is no case law to even begin to define the terminology. So that's one very nebulous gray area. There's the second gray area. It's the one that you just gestured to. That is, you end up in this kind of abstract graduate school seminar, comparing and contrasting Israeli apartheid with South African apartheid, and saying, is one better than the other? Is one worse than the other? Which features do they have in common? Which features are distinct? Which features are critical? Which features are not critical in the definition of apartheid? That's another graduate school seminar in addition to the seminar on what do we mean by apartheid, what do we mean by oppression, domination, inhumane acts. So my view is we should focus on the terminology which, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, already has a resonance among a broad public. So I prefer to focus on the fact that B'Tselem said Israel is a Jewish supremacist state. Jewish supremacy, it has a resonance because we've been here talking the last 5 years or so about white supremacy. Human Rights Watch says Israel is a state based on Jewish domination. That too has a resonance here because for the past 5 years we've been talking about white domination in the United States. Those are also terms or a terminology or a political lexicon that's very easy to document. So somebody says, what do you mean Israel is a white supremacist state? Or it's built on, I should say, what do you mean Israel is a Jewish supremacist state? Or it's based on Jewish domination? You simply have to say, well, 93% of the land in the state of Israel is owned by the state and is set aside, reserved for Jews only. There are 900 towns in the state of Israel which legally can prohibit the residence by non-Jews. And so there's a huge amount of controversial, irrefutable evidence to support, or you could say, Palestinians constitute approximately 19% of the Israeli population, but they're overall confined to about, now my memory is forgotten, but I think it's 3% of the land in the state of Israel. You can correct me on that, but I think it's 3%. There are some of the mixed cities, but most of the Arab municipalities, they're confined to about 3% of the land. I think it's 3%, I'd have to check. So there are all sorts of ways you can easily document, uncontroversially document for a broad public that Israel is a Jewish supremacist state based on Jewish domination, and not to get bogged down in these arguments about what is apartheid, what are as a definition, what does it have in common with the original apartheid? Is it better or is it worse? Those are the kinds of discussions Israel loves, because then you get diverted into these abstract arguments, which academics love, because every academic, and even many an activist, wants to be a theoretician. So they love to discuss the theory, but you completely lose a broad public when you start engaging in these kinds of parsings and hair splittings and semantical arguments. Now, I recognize that if you're in the field of law and apartheid, there does exist a crime of apartheid, I can understand why lawyers, as they prosecute the case and as they bring it to the International Criminal Court, I could see why lawyers would engage in that sort of debate. As a matter of fact, Human Rights Watch said, we think that the International Criminal Court should add to its bill of indictment against Israel the crime of apartheid, which is a crime against humanity. They say we should add. And that's a very, it's a powerful weapon for them, because if what Human Rights Watch is saying is correct, that Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid, it's very hard for the chief prosecutor to kill the case. Right now, the case is in the stage of investigation, the State of Palestine case against Israel. It's in the investigatory stage, and there's a serious possibility that the chief prosecutor will try to kill the case because of fear of retaliation from the US and the EU. But if HRW says Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid, which is a crime against humanity under international law, that ranks higher than a war crime, it'll be hard for the chief prosecutor to kill the case. So I'm glad HRW is mounting the case of the crime of apartheid. But I think that's pretty much a legal question. It doesn't seem to me to be useful in the court of public opinion. I think that when you start talking to a broad audience about Human Rights Watch, the leading Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, they have now taken a forthright, unequivocal position that Israel, the state of Israel, not the occupied Palestinian territories, the state of Israel is based on Jewish supremacy and Jewish domination. I think that's a very powerful statement.
Great. Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that point. I wish we had more time, Norman. It's approaching 11 o'clock in the evening in Istanbul, where this conference is based. I was asked to just announce that there's going to be 2 more sessions, sessions 7 and 8 tomorrow at this conference. So thank you, Norman, for being with us. Take good care, and I'll turn it back over to the conference organizers in Istanbul to either end this session or to make concluding announcements. That's back to you, Sammy.
I think Fadi would announce.
Sure, Fadi, back to you then, Fadi, for conclusion and closing remarks. And I don't hear Fadi.
He might have left. No, he's there. I don't know what happened. But anyway, I think we ended. So, all right. It was a great conversation. Thank you very much, Norman.
You're welcome.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah,
everyone
thank
take
you.
care. Stay safe.
Absolutely. Thanks. So what's new for you, Norman?